What if I told you there was a science fiction novel that blends references to Greek myth, James Joyce, Einstein's theory of relativity, Kurt Gödel's constructible universe, and the Beatles? Let's look into it. The Einstein Intersection by Samuel R. Delany might be one of the strangest science fiction novels I've ever read. Beginning with a quote from Finnegans Wake by James Joyce, which should be enough of a clue that Delany has loftier, more modernist or even postmodernist ambitions in mind, the book reads like a delirious fever dream, a half-remembered myth from ancient days, retold by a race of mutated characters centuries after the collapse of human civilization. The whole thing is further abstracted by Delany's distinct narrative style, a sort of literary decollage of clashing influences, and the countercultural curiosity for spiritualism through drugged-out psychedelia, which finds its own intersection between quaint sci-fi adventure story and something approaching gonzo journalism. A kind of fear and loathing in a galaxy far, far away. On the surface, the story is a vague retelling of the myth of Orpheus. Its central character, Loathing, a herdsman with an appearance similar to that of the god Pan, leaves his quiet village and journeys into the electronic labyrinth of our own forgotten past on a quest to bring his recently deceased lover Fraser back from the land of the dead. Along the way, he takes up arms against a mutated Minotaur, joins forces with a band of dragon-riding scavengers, and faces his own mortality in a strange futuristic city populated by decadent ciphers. A lot of these subplots and set pieces sound like standard science fiction fare. However, throughout the book, Delany deconstructs what could have been a conventional hero's journey, transforming his already ambitious concept into a kind of philosophical hall of mirrors, bringing to the Orphean myth elements of post-apocalyptic science fiction, fantasy imagery, folklore, surrealism, and the fourth wall-breaking deconstructions of experimental metafiction. In one chapter, we might be reading something that feels almost like Tolkien, with wandering travellers traversing a strange landscape full of extravagant mythical creatures, only for the next chapter to plunge us into the more metaphysical realms of the drugged-out 1960s. This contrast was one of the things I enjoyed most about the book. The way the world-building, which could be described as a kind of primitive futurism, continually collides with the more weird and eccentric elements of the story, giving the book a definite element of unpredictability. In keeping with that spirit of primitive futurism, the characters of Delany's book live in rural communities, which seem almost medieval. Again, we could see this as reminiscent of Tolkien, with these characters living simple if hard-working lives as part of these mythical communities bound by primitive law. However, as Loathing sets out on his journey, we find scattered throughout the landscapes of the book remnants of advanced technologies, which these characters are unable to comprehend. In a lot of ways, this contrast between the primitive and the futuristic, or more plainly between the influences of fantasy and science fiction, reminded me a lot of another interesting work of mid-1960s speculative fiction, Rocannon's World by Ursula K. Le Guin. Like Rocannon's World, the Einstein Intersection blurs the line between fantasy and science fiction influences, capturing the thrill and adventure of characters, exploring the vast landscapes of unknowable worlds from atop mythical winged creatures, while at the same time indulging in lengthy existential dialogues on time, fate, and the evolution of humanity. Of the two, Rocannon's World is arguably the more accessible. The odd longers and disjointed structure of Le Guin's book can be chalked up to it being the author's debut novel. However, the writing of Le Guin still succeeds in transporting the reader, providing the rush of adventure and escapism that we expect from the genre, and from stories of this type. In comparison, Delany's experiments with narrative feel closer to the influences of people like the playwright Bertolt Brecht, or perhaps even the filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard. Like these artists, Delany frequently breaks the fourth wall, shattering our illusion of the story as escapist fantasy, and with it, our connection to the characters as anything more than avatars for the author's various existential considerations. We're reminded throughout that what we're reading is a work of fiction, where the interjections of Delany as author again recall the theatre of Brecht, or the films of Godard. It's in this deliberate effort to alienate the reader, and to encourage critical interrogation over a more passive emotional immersion, that Delany achieves something that feels entirely unique, almost revolutionary within the genre. However, without the stronger socio-political framework often found in works by Brecht and the artists influenced by him, Delany's experiments with the book can also feel somewhat vague, even frustrating. Just pausing to add an author's note of my own here. If we read the book through the lens of Afrofuturism, then certainly there is a strong socio-political framework to Delany's story. I'm thinking specifically of the themes of displacement, of a character having to leave home with its own traditions and strong cultural heritage, and then having to assimilate themselves into a new culture that is steeped in wealth and privilege, and as such hostile to anyone outside of that culture. I'm also thinking of the significance of the cage. That's cage spelled with a K, which plays a central role in the governing of Lo-Lobe's village, and what this might represent in both political and psychological terms. It's also worth mentioning that a later scene in the book has an allusion to a character being lynched, which has obvious direct political connotations given that the book was written against the backdrop of the civil rights movement. So I'm not suggesting in this comparison between Delany and Brecht that the book lacks a socio-political framework, but rather that the socio-political framework of the book is sometimes obscured by the inherent surrealism of the story and the sometimes vagaries of Delany's high fantasy inventions, which I try to clarify in more detail in the next part of the review. The story seems to drift from scene to scene, alternating moments of lushly descriptive dreamlike observation with more didactic discussions on the story's key themes. Chapters stop abruptly, sometimes mid-sentence, before the same sentence picks up again in the following chapter, like a disconnected thought. This makes Delany's interjections feel more like interruptions, which break the flow of the story, becoming like transmissions from the author's psyche, trapped like the proverbial ghost in the machine, or more appropriately perhaps given the book's allusions to Orpheus, like the typical Greek chorus. These interjections take the form of fragmented diary entries, literary quotations, metafictional notes, as well as advertising slogans from old TV commercials that were popular at the time the book was being written. At one point, the author invokes the Beatles as if quoting characters from an ancient text, establishing the band and their music as part of the general mythology of this future world. He even identifies Ringo Starr as another Orpheus-like figure, connecting him to the influence of his own protagonist, Lo-Lobe. As a concept, this reads as strange, gnomic, silly. But it's definitely original. In one of the more audacious indulgences, Delany stops the story to add a lengthy author's note, something that reads like a typical introduction to a later reprint, in which the writer reflects upon his various inspirations for the book, as well as its themes and intentions. However, this introduction arrives around 70 pages into the story, breaking the flow of the book, and with it, our illusion of it as a work of escapist fiction. Again, I think the point of this is intentional. Delany is tapping into that 1960s postmodernist tendency for stories to be taken apart and put back together again, often in jarring and experimental ways. Taking what could have been a conventional sci-fi adventure story and connecting it to the influences of James Joyce, William Burroughs and Hunter S. Thompson, or envisioning a generic fantasy pastiche through the influences of films like Alphaville by Jean-Luc Godard or Trans-Europ-Express by Alain Robbe-Grillet. The indulgence is of course a provocation. It's meant to challenge the reader, abstracting the story through this prism of ever-shifting surfaces, trapping the character in this labyrinthine hall of mirrors, which refracts and expands the story into ever more distant and intangible reflections of its original form. However, even in the book's most obscure moments, the writing is still filled with fascinating ideas. For instance, instead of traditional gendered signifiers like Mr. and Mrs. or Sir and Madam, Delany's characters use titles like Lo, La and Lee. Some characters, like Lo-Lobe's friend and fellow villager, Loathing, are hermaphrodites, possessing both male and female reproductive organs. That Loathing has a child that could be the result of a relationship with either Lo-Lobe, who is biologically male, Fraser, who is biologically female, or their own self, which is biologically both, introduces ideas about gender and sexuality that feel surprisingly progressive for a science fiction novel written in the mid-1960s. Me again. Obviously progressive in this context as comparative to other hero's journey type science fiction and fantasy stories, which tend to draw on more conventional presentations of knights and damsels, and the usual romance as reward courtships that tend to dominate stories of this type. That this aspect of the book is progressive in this context doesn't preclude it from being seen as problematic from a different perspective, but that's really a discussion for someone more informed and better educated than myself. I also wanted to acknowledge that the term hermaphrodite is obviously outdated and largely offensive when applied to people, where the term intersex is considered preferable. However, as the characters of Delany's book are alternately described as either mutants or aliens, then it's hopefully less problematic in this context. Anyway, back to the review. Even though I enjoyed the book overall, and found much to admire in Delany's unconventional style, I have to admit I did get lost occasionally in some of the more drifting abstractions of the story. After a great start, which develops the lore and legacy of the world and its characters in great detail, culminating of course with Low-Loby's battle against the Minotaur and the discovery of a volatile, archaic supercomputer called Phaedra, the middle section of the book, involving Loby's travels with the dragon-riding scavengers and his pursuit of the mythical Kid Death, a literal harbinger of death modelled on the Wild West outlaw Billy the Kid, were often confusing and sometimes repetitive by comparison. However, I thought the final sections of the book, in which Low-Loby arrives at the futuristic city of Branning at Sea, ended the book on a dazzling and disarming note. Rather than conclude the story with a moment of great action or spectacle, the novel instead ends on a moment of introspection. Here, Delany turns the gaze of the character inward, questioning his own pursuit of death and the existential crisis we all face when we stare too long into the void of our own mortality. The final chapter really underlined for me that feeling of the surreal, the dreamlike, with the writing of Delany again reminding me of the influence of Alain Robbe-Grillet, specifically his screenplay for the 1961 film, Last Year at Marienbad, in which a party of strange characters haunt a gathering at a palatial estate, leading to deeper, existential meditations on the story's key themes. It's also worth acknowledging here that Robbe-Grillet's second novel, The Erasers from 1953, is apparently a detective novel structured around a retelling of the story of Oedipus, another intersection between Greek myth and genre pastiche. Even after spending several weeks drafting my notes for this review, the overall meaning of the Einstein Intersection still feels somewhat out of reach. It's one of those books where the perception or understanding of the story keeps shifting, first from page to page, then later in our own recollections of the story as we look back on it. This apparent intangibility perhaps illustrates why Delany's preferred and more appropriate title for the book was A Fabulous Formless Darkness. Throughout the story there are discussions on humanity's fate, personal identity, death and the renewal of the self. I think a big part of the book is also about how cultural evolution can be seen as a part of cultural revolution and vice versa. That Low-Loby has a dagger that can be played as a flute, suggesting the lyre of Orpheus in that further intersection throughout the story between creation and destruction, or more plainly, between life and death. It also underlines the importance of music as a form of communication, both in the references to the Beatles and in the musicality of the text, and how this in turn is reflected in Delany's jazz-like approach to writing, where all the notes are there, just not necessarily in the expected order. The often messy indulgences and jarring deconstructions of the book, combined with Delany's problematic reputation as a writer, owing to the controversial legacy of his near unreadable 1995 novel Hogg, will likely alienate some readers. However, I found the book to be a largely enjoyable and thought-provoking read. In the movie palace of my imagination where these stories play out, the imagery that Delany conjures, especially towards the end of the book, was jaw-dropping in its surrealism, and in the rich cinematic quality of the author's descriptions of people, places, senses, and emotions. This is, undoubtedly, a strange and ambitious work. If you've read the Einstein Intersection and you have any thoughts on the book, or if you have any suggestions or recommendations for science fiction novels that are even more eccentric and strange than this, then do let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching,